Checking microphone. We're live, aren't we? We'll be back in just a little bit, guys. Hey, thanks for joining tonight. It depends on which John Dalton you're talking about. But you tell me. We'll be back in just a little bit. Microphone's working. Making sure that mic is working. Making sure we got control. Oh yeah. Make sure that mic's working. We ready. Ready. Oh, Jay's baby's not here because Jay's here. Because if that baby was here, she wouldn't be here. Baby not here yet. What? Oh, I can hear my headphones in the microphone. We'll be calling up Grandpa Underground here in just a second. We got to go make sure this is being shared because I don't know if y'all are sharing it. Hell if I know if y'all be sharing shit. I got to go make sure it's being shared because my wrench is probably be talking babies. Oh, we're live, that's for sure. Dad with the phone talks to Dad with a badge. This is gonna be a good one because I hadn't even prepped my dad. We hadn't even talked nothing. We probably we talked since our last talk, but we haven't talked about this stuff. I talked to him this weekend and said, "Boy, you gotta come on Wednesday," and he said, "All right, let's do Wednesday." Well, he didn't really say that. We just texted back and forth. So I just texted him about an hour ago. Said, "You gonna be ready to go at 8?" And he said he's gonna be ready to go right at 8. So we're going to be right on time. So if you're just now joining, I'm not going to go through this when I get my dad on the phone because I don't need to do this. But some of y'all are so new, I want you to understand that my dad is a law enforcement expert of over 49 years in law enforcement. He's worked on over almost 200 homicides. He's led criminal investigations units. He's led SWAT teams. He's led federal drug task force. He retired. His last retirement was from the DA's office where he was a investigator for the DA. So he made sure that all the law enforcement brought in their... He made sure law enforcement brought in the correct info to be able to prosecute. And so we're going to talk all that. He is the foremost expert that anyone's talked to on YouTube. I don't care who they are. Very few people have the degrees and the training and the background. Very few people even today that are either in law enforcement or not in law enforcement. The only people that may have a little bit more to say or have more expertise and to say are the actual officers working the case, but we can't talk to those guys yet. So I'm going to try to we're going to try to talk about evidence. I want to talk about the evidence that's going to be going into the trial. I want to talk about how much evidence they're going to need since they don't have a body. We barely touched on this stuff, so it's going to be fun. Yeah, so Lily, that's why I was just giving you a quick little update. Because last time, you can go back and listen to... the podcast before. I just don't want to have to go through my dad's resume again with him. So I'm just kind of giving you the background of my father. All of this is verifiable. I mean, my dad's been in law enforcement since I was born. He started as a detective in the Waco Police Department, and then all the way through into federal drug task force and all the way criminal investigations units, homicides, SWAT team, all that stuff. So he was captain. Anyway, you can go listen to his other interview, and you can hear his resume from himself. Today, I'm just going to jump him right into it. I want to jump right into talking about the case, finding out about how much evidence they're really going to need, because if they don't find a body or remains, how much evidence could there be inside the apartment that someone who was doing a welfare check didn't see? You know, how much real blood evidence could there be? So, all that stuff. Wow, D-Watt stoked. It'll be a good one. Well, it'll be, hopefully it's good. It's 8 o'clock at night. He probably had his dinner already. He's already ready to go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jam up some music here for a second. I'm going to go over, I'm going to give him a call. I'm going to get off the mic for a second, make sure he's warmed up, make sure there ain't no line difficulties, and then we'll be back in just a sec. With Dad with the Phone talks to Dad with a badge and a gun, maybe. I wonder if he wears his gun at home still. We'll see. All right. Well, we're live now. So you're listening to Dad with a Phone, and I also have, well, Dad with the Badge. He don't have a badge anymore, but he's retired of 49 years in law enforcement. We went through the resume last time, so we're not going to get into the resume or anything like that. You can go listen to part 1 before. How are you doing, Dad?
I'm doing great.
Are y'all under? Are y'all still under snow?
No, most of the snow's melted, but there's still some on the shady side of the mountain.
So did y'all get hit with the bomb cyclone thing?
107 miles an hour temperature, wind speed.
Oh my gosh. So my dad lives up in the mountains too. He lives up at 8,500 feet as well. Just different mountain. So, well, that's crazy. Well, everything, the power back on and everything?
Yeah, power's back on. We're just cleaning up trees and fallen trees and fallen limbs and debris and stuff. But, yeah, everybody's got their power back.
All right, well, that's cool. Well, Dad, we're coming up to the arraignment hearing for Patrick Frazee on April 5th. And just for the lay person out there that doesn't understand kind of how the court system, lays out with people, what's possible to happen at an arraignment hearing like this?
Well, arraignment hearings are usually to present the charges to the person, make sure that there's not any motions that either side wants to put forth. Also, they may, depending on the state of Colorado, and I'm not sure exactly what their procedure is, but a lot of times there may be even some preliminary testimony in reference to probable cause to bound the person over for trial.
Okay, so yeah, and they've had a couple of hearings already. We've had motion hearings, and then we had a thing they called pretrial. And at the pretrial, they did have some testimony given from some law enforcement agents, from one Christopher Adams of the Woodland Park PD, and then one Slater. I think his name is Greg Slater from Criminal Investigation, CBI. And they read some testimony that was given from the girlfriend, Crystal Lee Kinney. That testimony that was given by the police officers, that's kind of the sworn testimony that she gave, or the stuff she had talked about. And in that testimony, she gives really grim details of some stuff that happened. And then kind of speculation back and forth on what Patrick told her had happened. So there was no objections to any of those testimonies given in that pretrial stuff. Is all of that information that went through the pretrial where he gets to read all that stuff, will all of that happen again at a trial, or will that stuff have to go through approval as evidence into the trial?
Well, the officers probably won't be able to testify to what she said at trial, but they will have to, what they have already put forth, she will have to actually physically testify to.
Yeah, so they can't use that sworn statement. She'll have to take the stand, and she will have to testify in the court.
Well, the only time they'll use the sworn statement or the statements that she gave officers will be to corroborate her statement in court. In other words, once she gives her testimony and is subject to cross-examination by the defense, then if the defense has seen that written statement, then they'll try to, say, well, she's changed her story or she's added to it, and then they might be able to use the officers to come in to corroborate or clarify or as rebuttal witnesses. So, they're not going to be able to necessarily testify to what she said, except to corroborate the statement she gives in court. She's got to be able to be there in court and give that same statement, and then be subject to cross-examination.
And I don't know if you've had a chance. I know you've seen a little bit of the court documents and paperwork. None of us have actually seen the statement or the written affidavit by law enforcement. We only have a version of that statement that is communicated through actual tweets, because they didn't release that affidavit or those statements. They didn't release her statement. It was given by an officer, and it was tweeted out of the courtroom by multiple reporters. But until we have that thing in our hand, we don't know exactly what that said. The one thing I wanted to know about is with evidence, and we talked about this a little bit on the last one, where the first officers went in there and they didn't find anything during the wellness check that alarmed them to immediate criminal activity. They did some different, they looked around and they looked for stuff, but they didn't see what later we would find out would be some blood splatter and different things. So we don't know how much blood splatter. We don't know how much blood evidence. We do know there's some unknown DNA that was mentioned in these affidavits and mentioned in different warrant things. But how much physical evidence will they need when they don't have a body?
Well, I can't really speak to how much physical evidence they need. The thing is a trial is set up so that you present what you have to convince a jury that there is evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, that could be a little bit of evidence, along with testimony and other such circumstantial evidence. So, you don't necessarily, there's not a line to draw to say, well, you need this much evidence. You can't say that. It's whatever it takes to convince a jury that there's beyond a reasonable doubt that this person committed the crime. So you can't say, well, how much evidence? I mean, there's no standard to say or a line to draw to say this is what you need.
Gotcha. So
whatever convince the jury is what you need.
Gotcha. In your history in the court system and stuff, though we kind of talked about this and you put a number out there, but I don't want to hold you to that number. It's pretty slim, though, the number of cases that either go to trial or a conviction in a murder case without a body. It's a pretty slim number, isn't it?
Well, it hurts because there's always that reasonable doubt that person's still alive.
Gotcha.
If you can't prove the person's dead or convince the jury that the person is actually deceased, then you don't have a murder case. So, it is difficult without some type of physical body. Now, that doesn't mean you don't need a whole body. You could have as little as bones.
Yeah, no. If there's any sort of remains that can be tied back to Kelsey as DNA or anything, then that would be enough to say that there would have been a crime of murder.
Right. And so that's why they're difficult with just circumstantial evidence to convince a jury that there's proof beyond a reasonable doubt that the person was murdered and that person actually did the murder.
And so, so that it makes sense. it scares me a little bit in this case only because one of their key witnesses, we don't know that it's their key witness, but one of their key witnesses is a woman who also had something to do with the case, or had something to do with the crime in some form or fashion. How extensive she was involved, we don't know, because they haven't told us that. They've only told us what they charged her with, but we don't know actually how much she actually saw, what she could testify to, all that. She talks about a very, bloody scene at the crime scene that she cleaned up. When it comes to evidence from, like, what would be, so a police officer is going to collect the evidence. That evidence is going to go into some sort of evidence locker, evidence safe at the police station. When they talk about doing consumptive testing on the evidence, where they're going to do some consumptive testing on something, can you explain kind of what that would mean just to the lay person?
Well, that's a term that they use when the evidence, whatever they've collected, whether it be blood sample or saliva or body fluids or something like that, that evidence is going to be used up in the testing of it. So they're not going to be able to give you a blood splatter in court because they used up the blood to test it for DNA or to match to somebody. In other words, the testing actually consumes the evidence. But by documenting the chain of custody, the lab analysis, the lab people who actually handled the test or handled the object, and by the testimony of the officers who obtained it in the first place, you establish a chain of custody where you can show in court that this evidence actually existed in the first place.
Gotcha. And I'm trying to think of, I got a couple other questions. Let me see if there's anything in chat. I was just seeing if anything popped up, but there's a lot of people chatting through, so I just want to make sure there wasn't anything that came up that I hadn't thought of. When so all of those people, though, the people that tested the evidence, the people who collected the evidence, all of those people would maybe have to come in and testify to that consumptive evidence for sure, correct? At some
well, if the prosecution was going to present that evidence in court, in other words, that evidence helped support their case, then yes, those people would have to testify.
Yeah, I just
now,
yeah.
If that evidence didn't support the case, and he did not want to use them or use that evidence in court, then no, those people aren't going to be called to testify.
Perfect. Same thing goes like if some whack job with a drone took some video footage of when they were running the warrant. If they were going to use that footage in court, they'd have to call that guy with the drone in to testify to that video, yeah?
If they were going to use it in court, yeah.
All right. Yep. Would they not? They wouldn't necessarily go to that guy, though, and tell him all that beforehand. They would mainly just wait until that trial time, and that's when they just make all of these witnesses that they're going to list on that list. We kind of talked about that big witness list. Yeah.
Well, like I said in the last time you came up with that question, all the people on that witness list may or may not testify. They may or may not be called. But the prosecution and the defense, if they're going to call them, or if there's a possibility that they'll call them, they will put them on the list so that they don't run into a problem if they do call them and try to explain to the judge why they weren't on the list in the first place. So thing is if they wanted to use some evidence, some video footage that crazy person took.
What are you talking about, crazy person?
Well, you're the one that put the crazy person.
Oh, I did, didn't I? I maybe said that. Yeah, I probably did.
But if they wanted to use that footage in their presentation, they would subpoena you to court to testify to verify that footage is what it appears to be. Now, they may call you and say, hey, we need to talk to you about it before the trial, or they may just send you a subpoena. Now, just because you're on the witness list doesn't mean you're going to get a subpoena. It just means that there's a possibility you might get a subpoena.
No, understand. I threw that little question in there kind of already knowing that, but a lot of people have been asking me that. I do have a question. In one of the affidavits at the pretrial, they say that they found a third-party male DNA. Now, would they say they found a third party? Yeah, they said it's a third party unknown male DNA in the household when they did some test collecting. But the only way to test, they would have had to have run tests on that, correct? I mean, like you can't determine DNA by no other means except by running some sort of lab test, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that was kind of confusing to me because that happened at pretrial, but we didn't hear about any of that testing. Now, the reason I think we didn't hear about it maybe is because if they had collected enough DNA to test from an unknown male, but they had enough of it that it wasn't going to consume whatever they had, there probably wouldn't have been any motions filed to stop that testing, because we did have a motion filed to stop consumptive testing. But if they wanted to test other DNA and maybe they had enough evidence that they weren't going to consume all the DNA, there would be necessarily an objection from the defense, because there's still DNA there if they need to go back and test it later. Is that an easy assumption to make with that? Because they did tell us that they had DNA from an unknown male.
Now you're trying to get me to speculate, but the thing is the reason that they did present it is because they've got to. If the defense found out that there was, or if it hadn't been presented to the defense so that they could look at it, or presented to where it was stated that it was found, the defense would say, well, you're trying to hide evidence that exonerates our client.
Oh, so maybe that's why they brought it up in the pretrial?
Right.
I got you. So they brought that up because they don't want them to be able to come back and say they're hiding evidence, or they're going to bring all the evidence forward.
Right.
Gotcha.
And so you bring it all forward because now, as far as the consumptive, and that's one of the reasons why they use that term, and they also that's telling the court that we may not have the blood stain or the blood. They'll have pictures of it, or they'll have pictures of something that is visible, but they can't make the blood available in the court because it's been consumed. Now, DNA is a little different thing, because DNA can come from as little as skin flakes, a hair, a scab, blood. It can come from a lot of different things. Now, they may have in court the object that the DNA was found on, or pictures of the object that the DNA was found on. But and that is the same as long as they can verify the pictures or have the person who took the pictures verify that that's where the DNA was found. That can be presented in court. Now, why they wouldn't call it as something that was going to be consumed in the testing is because what they do with that is the chemicals that they actually use or the object, whatever it was they used, can also be retested.
Retested and it should show that DNA.
Right.
Yeah, I got you.
If there's any discrepancy, if the defense wants to pay for their own DNA test.
Okay, so that does bring me to a question that actually came up in court while I was there. There was this argument over a CBI policy about how CBI, Colorado Bureau of Investigation, it's a policy that they test all the evidence in their labs that they collect. And that's part of their policy. But another part of their policy is that some of that testing is done in secret, or not. It's not, they didn't use the word secret, but is done in private. Now, there's some sort of constitutional law that says the defense can be present during all testing, and there was some sort of bickering back and forth between the judge and the state because the judge was not willing to make a ruling. He was about to rule in favor of the defense because he wasn't going to change the Constitution for a policy at CBI. I'm more one to ask, in your history, like, was there ever a policy that the police department had or an investigation unit had that was brought up in court that may had not been in line with a federal or a constitutional law like that?
Well, yeah, and it didn't necessarily have to do with policy. It had to do with rules of evidence between federal law and state law. In a case that was dealt with, it started out as a federal case and was turned over to the state for prosecution. And the rules of collection of evidence sometimes are a little bit different. For instance, what constitutes probable cause to make a search on a vehicle by the federal agent is not necessarily the same rules that pertain to an officer from the state of New Mexico making a search on a vehicle.
Oh, so like maybe the state of New Mexico has a little more lenient, or more.
Well, actually, they have a more strict.
Oh, more strict. Gotcha.
For instance, under federal law, a customs and ICE agent only needs probable cause to believe that there's contraband in the vehicle to search that vehicle. He doesn't have to get a warrant to search it. In New Mexico, unless you get consent from the driver, you have to have a search warrant to search a person's vehicle.
Oh, and I can see how, like, if a federal agent busted a car, but then they turned it over to the state to prosecute it, the state would be like, well, they didn't have probable cause to search the car to begin with because of the state law.
No, they didn't have a search warrant.
Or they didn't have a they didn't have a search warrant. They didn't have a search warrant. Gotcha.
In New Mexico too, if a narcotics dog alerts on a vehicle, that allows, and you don't get consent, you can't get consent, or they don't give consent after that dog alerts on the vehicle, then you got to get a search warrant. In the federal law, if a dog alerts on the vehicle and you don't give consent, then they still have probable cause to search the vehicle.
Yeah.
And they stop a vehicle and they do a secondary on the vehicle. If they don't get consent or if they feel like it's coerced and because the dog hits on it, they will conduct a secondary search or a secondary inspection. And then if it's not enough drugs that are found in the vehicle to file it on a federal case, they'll call the state officers or the sheriff's department to come and file the case through the state courts. But because they didn't get a search warrant on the vehicle, there's been some, I don't know if any cases have been thrown out, but it's been real dicey trying to run it through the state courts without a search warrant on the vehicle.
Okay, so that's kind of an example of where the federal rules may be a little different than the state rules, and where in this case where CBI says, it's our policy to test everything, and there is some of the testing that has to be done in private or only to CBI employees, where the defense could argue, well, the law says we can be present during all testing. And so I can see how the judge would go back and forth. They actually postponed that motion. And so that motion has been postponed to even after the arraignment, and or to be handled on the day of the arraignment. I think actually to come up with that motion on whether or not, or if they came up with an agreement on how that testing is going to be done.
The thing is, and I understand why the CBI wants to do it that way and has that policy. They want to maintain the chain of custody. They don't want the chain of custody, especially on chemical analysis, to be compromised in any way. So that's why they specify only their employees are involved or even present during it. That's something they're going to have to work out with the state legislature or the court system in New Mexico to try to determine, hey, we're trying to protect the integrity of the chain of custody of this evidence, and yet you're saying we have to have some second party come in and watch it and possibly contaminate that chain of custody.
So that's why the policy's in place. That's a logical reason for the policy to be in place.
That's right.
Yeah, no, I understand that. When it comes to all this media and press and social media and podcast and all this stuff that's happening now, and we're even seeing more and more of it. There's a case right now in trial. It's actually in trial right now, that was brought to light by a podcaster. It was a cold case, or the guy was arrested because of a tip that was brought in through a podcast. With all this playing out in social media and stuff, and there are posts, we know that there are posts being sent to the police officers for tips and stuff like that. How much of that evidence have you seen? I know you've been out of the game about a year. Well, you've been retired how long from the DA's office now?
Well, the 31st of this month, it'll be 2 years.
2 years. So in the time that, 2 years ago or even earlier, how much, it might not have been playing much, did you ever see social media or stuff from media come out and be used in trial at all?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Not so much tweets or stuff like that, but Facebook, amazing, and I want to be delicate in this, how crazy some people are to commit a crime and to post it to Facebook.
Oh, yeah, it's crazy.
Photos of themselves, in one particular case I'm familiar with, photos of themselves displaying the firearms that they used in the murder.
Yeah, right.
Or making statements implicating themselves or others, and usually it ends up photos, or the comments themselves are not so much used, but they are used many times to corroborate somebody's eyewitness testimony, or to show that this person, although they say, well, I don't have any guns or never had any guns. Well, what are these two guns that you're holding here in this picture that was on your Facebook page? So.
Yeah. Gotcha. So you've seen it used in conjunction, either in court or by law enforcement, probably too, beforehand, to try to get more information.
Oh yeah.
Because it sounds like where they're asking someone, if it's law enforcement, for sure, being able to go in there and pull that stuff and do that. But it's funny because one of the posts that they actually used, or that they listed in the warrant as maybe that came in as a tip, it turned out not to be a valid post, even though it was a pretty incriminating post. If it had it been a valid post, it was going to look real bad for Patrick Frazie's mom. But it just turned out to be kind of either a random post or a very bad misplaced joke kind of post. Either way.
Well, anytime you're going to use any of that in court, there has to be corroboration. There has to be verification, either by obtaining the IP address of the person that posted it, or some other substantial evidence to go with it to substantiate that. It can be used as evidence, but it's got to be corroborated. All evidence has to be corroborated in one way or another.
How do they? And so, yeah, that brings us to KK's testimony, and we still got about 30 minutes left. KK's testimony is pretty elaborate at the simplest thing. Like, if you had a suspect say to you, I purposely were going to ping these phones together so that you guys would, see this, would you believe that?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what they mean by pinging them together.
Well, KK tells a story that, like, she left some blood on purpose. So that, because she was the one that cleaned up. She tells the story that she left this blood by here and she left the blood here. If, in fact, blood was in those spots, I mean, that would kind of corroborate her testimony, correct?
Well, any details that can be corroborated help bolster the testimony.
Yeah, and so she tells a testimony of a lot of blood, and that it took her 4 hours to clean up the apartment. There was blood all over the apartment. And then there's a couple of little details that they use, like the phone pings, to kind of track her movements and her timings, because she tells them this timing and these different things. But then she goes even as far as to tell them that, yes, I left some blood for you to find, and here is where it was at. Now, that just seems crazy to me, but I mean, if you heard that testimony, and maybe this is why the officer said this is not a linear or logical testimony, but it just seems like if someone was to come and confess and said they actually left evidence, because she actually says that she kept the phones together and like purposely turned them on in Grand Junction, and then she purposely turned them on in Salt Lake City so that they would ping together. And then she also tells them kind of this story about how she cleaned up and she left some blood. It's just really a strange testimony in which they kind of shared But they probably didn't share all of her testimony at the pretrial, I would assume. I don't know.
Well, you know, they wanted, at your pretrial, in that particular case, it sounds like they wanted enough probable cause presented that there wouldn't be any question that it should be bound over for trial. And sharing a few details helps do that.
Yeah, I guess since they don't have a body, they have to give some sort of graphic. I mean, they have to give this depiction of a crime, and the only depiction of that crime they have is her testimony, and so I guess those are the reason. This is the reasoning behind sharing some of her testimony in the graphic manner that they did.
Oh yeah.
But well, if you're Patrick, Dad, no, you're not Patrick. But if you're trying to get into the head of Patrick, into the mind of Patrick, this is a guy who hasn't said anything since the day he hasn't said anything but, hey, this is a private road and this is a private property. And then, you know, he said a few words in court. But other than that, he hasn't said anything that we know of. Actually, he gave a 15-minute phone call to law enforcement, and he does tell a pretty elaborate story that has some big holes in it. And so, but after that story was told on this phone call, that was a recorded phone call with Officer Huber from the Woodland Park Police Department, and the story about the last time that he saw Kelsey, the conversation, what it was about, them breaking up, they're ending this relationship. He says the last time I saw her was when we exchanged babies in the alleyway, and he tells that story. But then they actually have, you know, some other records, phone pings, some receipts, some video footage of him at another store here in town, and maybe even some video footage of him driving in the direction of Kelsey's house again, and him in the area of Kelsey's house because of phone pings. But a phone ping doesn't pinpoint your location, but we talked about this a little bit, that if you tracked it over time, it could kind of pinpoint it, I guess. I'm just wondering, like, that testimony that they shared on that, they did share that tape live of that recording. It was like a 15-minute recording of him. Is that tape admissible because he wasn't under arrest, or he wasn't detained? It was a video. It was a telephone call, but they didn't, you know, they hadn't arrested him. They were simply asking questions of him. Would something like that be admissible in a court?
Well,
he didn't.
Yeah, if he wasn't present with the officers, where they physically could keep him from leaving, even though they would say, "Oh, well, you're not under arrest; you can leave at any time." You know, any of that stuff before he was arrested or before he was detained, if it was general information that they were trying to get to determine, you know, her whereabouts and so forth, yeah, it's admissible. If he wants to rebut it, he can get on the stand and rebut it. But his attorneys aren't going to let him. And the main reason he's not saying anything now, or hasn't said anything since he's been arrested, is his attorneys are telling him, don't say anything. And that's, if I was in his shoes, I'd do the same thing. I wouldn't say anything. Because the thing is, many times, the defendant buries himself by talking to too many people about too many things that can be, that holes can be blown into, or witnesses can rebut, and so, you know, if you're arrested, you need a defense attorney worth his worth anything will tell you don't say anything.
But every law enforcement on the face of the planet is trained to try to get you to say as much as possible, correct?
Exactly.
How crazy is that, right? The defense attorney
it's not crazy. It's the criminal justice system. Okay? The officer wants you to talk. Your attorney doesn't want you to talk. Because the criminal justice system is you're innocent until proven guilty. The defense attorney is going to tell you, let them prove you guilty. Don't prove yourself guilty by talking to them.
So let's talk about one last thing here, and then this will probably take us into the end here. I'm gonna look through here and see if there's any questions I need to ask. What about the man at the bank PF met? Who was he? Oh, there's speculation on a lot. They have some video from a bank with Patrick with another person, but none of that. All that speculation on who were all these people. Well, we don't know. I'm just looking here. One thing I wanted to ask about was all the charges they did stack on him. So let's say that they take him to court and they've charged him with like 8 different charges, from solicitation, 3 counts of solicitation, some sort of charge of criminal violence or crime with the violent or something, and then the murder charge and different things, some tampering charges. In a case like this where they don't have a body, at the arraignment, can they change? Okay, so they've added charges. They can take away charges and they can add more charges even up at the arraignment, correct? Because that's where he hasn't had to say I plead not guilty or guilty or any. He hasn't had to say any of that yet. He's basically kept his mouth shut. They've been doing these motion hearings. They've been hearing this pretrial stuff. But that arraignment that's coming up, it's a pretty good possibility he's going to have to say, I plead not guilty, or we made a deal or something.
Well, yeah. The thing is with the numbers of charges is when you're looking at the case and you look at the statutes, the penal statutes or whatever they call them in Colorado, criminal statutes, you charge the person with all the statutes that pertain to whatever the offense is. Murder, of course, being one. If he's alleged to have disposed of the body, then you've got tampering with evidence. If he's alleged to have solicited somebody else to help do the murders, and that didn't work out, so he did it himself, well, then you've got some solicitation charges. If it's a violent type crime, I say extremely violent, then you can add some of that. In some cases, if a firearm is used, you can add that. As far as the arraignment's concerned, if he hasn't stood up in front of the judge and answered the charges guilty or not guilty, or innocence, or whatever term you want to use, he's going to have to do that before they go to trial. The judge at that time will then say that he's going to set the bond, if they're going to set a bond, change a bond. If charges are dropped, they can be dropped at that time too, before he pleads guilty or not guilty to them. If there's a plea bargain, that may be a little bit early for any kind of plea bargaining, but that can come at any time too. Adding charges, if they're going to add charges, they're going to have to add them at that time. And I'm not sure if they can in Colorado, but they can. I think they can in New Mexico add them at the arraignment. But they'll have to read them to him so that he understands what the charges are.
Yeah, and they did read his charges out, or actually they waived the reading of the charges, and because obviously the attorneys had already told him, and so they're trying to make these court appearances as short as possible. So there's a lot of waiving of rights only to get past the reading of things. One thing that was brought up a couple of times, questions asked, if a jury could find him not guilty of murder based on reasonable doubt, could they still find him guilty of solicitation, or of, like, if they don't get the murder charge, can they still get those other charges?
They can find him guilty or not guilty on any of the charges.
So it doesn't even matter. It's not like they don't have to find him guilty of murder to find him guilty of solicitation or tampering or any of that.
Well, the tampering probably kind of goes along with the murder, but yeah, they can find him guilty or not guilty on any of the charges.
So, yeah, I was wondering about that. And then here's the one kicker: if for some reason, like, the case is a hung jury or something like that, but he gets off, would they have to give him back custody of his child?
That's a whole different animal. That's a civil problem.
Okay, so his custody of his child is not going to be determined. It may weigh in the factor in a civil case, but it's not going to be determined by the criminal case.
Well, the criminal case outcome could weigh in the civil case.
Yeah, it's going to weigh. Yeah, so if he's found not guilty, it could weigh into the civil case for his benefit, obviously. But a lot of people are wondering about that, about the baby. If he was found guilty of not murder, if he was found guilty of murder, that could weigh real. That's gonna heavily weigh into the civil case. But if he's not found guilty of murder, and maybe he's found guilty of solicitation or something, that could weigh in. The one question I have too is, what if the defense? Okay, we know this girl that is testifying. We know she's lied because they told us she lied at first, and then they also told us that she didn't sign her deal. I mean, she didn't say a word about Patrick until her deal was signed. And so then she started talking and telling them the story. What happens if in the defense or in the trial, she gets made to be a liar up there, and they discredit some or all of her story? And that's a big blow to this case. What would happen if she's caught lying? Would that ever affect her deal?
Well,
or like if she made the deal based on a lie?
I'm not aware of the details of her deal.
Yeah.
As far as whether she gets caught lying, how it would affect the case, well, that's up to the jury to determine whether they feel like she's credible enough in what she does say in this particular in her testimony. Now, the defense is going to try to discredit her in cross-examination, and they may be able to do that. It's their job is to convince the jury that she's lying all the time. Prosecution's job is to convince the jury that she was a liar, but now she's telling the truth. So that's kind of where it stands. Now, if she gets caught in a lie that's a provable lie, whether that's going to affect her plea bargain, her agreement, I can't speak to that because I don't know the details.
Yeah, nobody will ever know the details. That's actually a constitutional law that says the defense can never speak to those, or it's some sort of Colorado law that says the defense can never, or the defense nor the state can speak to the deal. Yeah, it is a weird situation because there's so many little unanswered things. Like it is in the record that she borrowed a car. That car had a gun in it. A bullet was missing from that gun when it was returned to the friend. The friend notified the police that the gun had been messed with, and so. But she doesn't tell any story. No, there's no version of the story that she tells the police that there was ever a gun fired or used, you know. And Patrick talks about a gun and talks about he gave her gun back to Kelsey and the keys and stuff, and then supposedly that gun was recovered. So there's all these little pieces to this story. Whether or not they have any bearing on the actual case, I don't know. Well, have you paid attention, or have you looked into this case anymore, or just the Dateline stuff and then the podcast that you did with me, or did you read any of those affidavits?
Oh yeah, I read some of the search warrants, some of the affidavits, some of the court documents.
So,
but I haven't seen anything in there that stood out as something that was like a smoking gun, supposedly.
Yeah, no, and that was, yeah, and the only thing that stands out, which is probably, I don't know how much of it was in there, because like I said, I don't believe they released the affidavits from KK or from Crystal's testimony, but we have tweets. And like Nikki was in the room listening to this officer give a description of her testimony, you know. And so like we do know that she gave a very detailed and elaborate testimony down to that she found a tooth, and then they found some teeth out. Just all kinds of stuff. But no smoking guns you saw sticking out there. How about any predictions?
No
predictions, Dad?
No, I quit trying to predict what a jury's going to hear, or what they hear and what they interpret and what they believe a long time ago, because juries are interesting animals. And I'm not calling individuals animals, believe me. I'm just saying that the makeup of a jury can make the big difference in whether they logically hear the evidence and make a logical decision, or whether they try to interpret it to their own way, or in some secondary way that even the defense or the prosecution doesn't even think about. So I can't. I quit trying to predict juries.
So that's a big deal. So I hadn't even thought about that. So what you're saying is you take 12 people, you set them in the same room, you give them all the same evidence, they tell the same story, they hear the same testimonies, they hear the same objections, they go back into their deliberation, and they all saw different things and heard different things, right?
Well, what you're trying to do in a trial is present your side of the case to show that there's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense is trying to present a case that mitigates that proof beyond a reasonable doubt, or that they're trying to put forward a case that there is a reasonable doubt. Now, a makeup of the jury, 12 people, sitting down, discussing it, they have to come, in a criminal case, they all have to come to the same consensus that the person is guilty. You can't have 2 or 3 or 1 for that says no, he's not guilty, and 11 that say he is guilty. It has to be unanimous. Now, in civil cases, it's a little different. But because it's a preponderance of the evidence in a civil case, and in some cases you don't have to have a unanimous decision. But in a criminal trial, you have to have a unanimous decision. So that always is a question mark in a criminal case.
I'm not sure I know 12 people that have ever agreed on anything. So,
well, that's the problem, is that there has to be 12 people that agree on it. At least one of the charges for anything to happen. If they decide that they don't agree and they're just going to say, well, we don't agree, that's when you come into a hung jury, or you can have a mistrial. That's the unknown factor in any jury trial, and that's why the voir dire, which is the process of selecting a jury, is so important.
What'd you call that?
Voir dire is what it's called.
Voir dire, huh? And so here's a question. So here in Teller County, they pull a jury based on registered voters. So the registered voters of Teller County, which is probably about, I don't know, I would guess about 8,000 maybe. And then they pull a percentage of those voters in for a jury pool, and that pool seems to be around 150 for big cases like this, rape, child. I've done some checking on how big of the jury pool they pulled when they did a big case, and it was about 150 jurors. And a lot of the cases that are big like that seem to get moved out of Teller County because they can take them to another county and they can pull from 1,000 jurors. It seems like in a case like this, it's a good possibility it may get moved out of Teller County.
Well, see, that's one of the you asked something about the media. You were talking earlier about the media. The media coverage makes a big difference in whether they try to get a change of venue, which is moving it to a different location.
Yeah, but I feel like in this case, I mean, this thing's made worldwide news. They're not going to be able to say, oh, down the street, Joe didn't hear it, but, across Colorado, they didn't hear nothing, because that's just not the fact.
Well, it could be a situation that comes up where they move it to Colorado Springs or something like that.
Yeah, what we've seen in the past here, instead of going to Colorado Springs, which is right down the road, they end up moving it across the state to like Durango because it's in the same division. It's not like, but it's it's 6 hours away or something. So and it's still got a pretty good sized jury pool. I hope they don't move it to Durango unless they pay for hotels for witnesses. Do you think they pay for hotels for witnesses? That's a joke. Hey, Dad, you've done a whole hour with me. Thank you so much. People have really enjoyed having you on because I just talk a bunch of BS. At least you have a badge to back it up, or at one point had a badge to back up what we talk about.
Oh, I still got badges, but they don't mean what they used to.
They don't mean what. So do you? But are you still strapped all the time or what?
I'm gonna plead the fifth on that one.
You're gonna plead the fifth, cause yeah, I bet. Who's
actually, I do have a concealed carry license.
Oh, you have a concealed carry license. There you go. What about down there since you have left? How are things running in the local law enforcement down there?
Oh, since I've left, they changed sheriffs, so it seems to be running okay now.
All right. Well, hey, thanks again, Dad. Everybody in chat is saying thank you, thank you, thank you. So, thanks for spending a little time on this crazy channel and this crazy subject. So, we'll talk to you later, Dad.
Okay.
All right. Bye. Well, kids, that was the second installment of Dad with a Phone talks to Dad with a Gun and a Badge. And I don't know if you learned anything or you didn't learn anything, but I did. I learned a little bit. I learned that it could get a little crazy come push OK, enable, bam. Check out that hat. Hey, look, if Jay's still in here, tell her I fixed her hat so that we could see it all. So that was fun. I like doing those with my dad because so I don't know if I can answer. Did you finish your timeline? I have almost finished my timeline. Well, I don't know what I just did there though. I have almost finished my timeline. I am gonna probably wait though, and the reason I'm gonna wait on my timeline is because I have some folks. I'm not gonna wait. I'm not gonna wait on it. I just have to export it out, and it's a long timeline, so it's a pretty extensive timeline. I got the whole, and I think I have some other stuff. Yeah, right. That's an awesome hat, by the way. I fixed the little eye for you, girl. Nikki went and got me a metallic marker, and we took care of it. But they had the thread in there. They just it was black thread. So anyway, I think it's a sweet hat. So, I do have that timeline done, and I'm gonna do it. But people think I'm kidding. Y'all think I'm joking, but all this work that Dad with a Phone has done on this case has not gone unnoticed, and people from around the world are contacting Dad, and so now I'm trying to be. Some people are like, that's what was going to happen. You're going to forget about us. No, I just want to feed my children. And so if someone says, hey, will you save that footage for us? And I go, yes, for a certain amount of money, don't be mad at me. But I think I can release enough on my timeline without releasing all the footage. I can use footage I've already released. I can do other stuff. So yes, I'm close. Thank you, Debbie, for showing up today. I don't know how many people were in here. I see I had 115 likes and 7 down likes. How can anybody dislike a law enforcement expert? They're just not American. We're talking about a real law enforcement expert. I'll tell y'all a secret. My dad, before we came on, like, when I got him on the phone beforehand, he was like, Michael, I am not going to sit here an armchair detective. He was not going to badmouth law enforcement. And I was never going to try to get him to badmouth law enforcement, by the way. I was just going to ask him questions. But he said that to me, and I was like, come on, Dad. You've been watching too much of the underground. Anyway, I thought it was funny. Damn trolls again. I know 7 of. Oh wait, just a second. Hey, there was 7 downs, and now there's only 6. One of them trolls came over to the dark side. One of the trolls came over to the dark side. So listen, a lot of you guys don't know where, like, my dad he's been a detective. He was lead of a criminal investigations unit. He was lead of a SWAT team. He ran a federal drug task force, and he retired as a DA investigator. So he spent his last few years in the DA's office doing the court thing. So that's why he understands that court system pretty well. He's a lot more diverse in the court proceedings than most law enforcement agents are. And so, yes, my dad kicked in doors for many, many years, worked on almost 200 homicide investigations. So super troll. Yeah, I know. There was a down. There were 7 downs. We converted a troll because there were 7 downs, and then all of a sudden there was a down that went away, and boom, more likes. That's troll conversion right there. I love it. Anyway, thank you. Thank you. Hey, do we have a baby yet? Was a baby born during my live? That's all I want to know. So hey, I'm gonna kick off this live so this can be a standalone by itself. I'm not gonna ramble on, but I'm too pumped up right now to get off. So I'm probably gonna come back in just a second. I'm gonna kick off, and I'm gonna let this roll into its own little device. Dadwithaphone talks and does the thing. So bam in the dark. Where did that go? Why did I move? So anyway, I'm gonna let that roll out. Roll some music up.